11:47 p.m., March 9, 1945. Lieutenant Nakamura Hiroshi pushed his Nakajima Ki-84 fighter to maximum climb rate over Tokyo Bay. His radio crackled with urgent orders. 300 American B-29 Superfortress bombers approaching from the south, altitude 7,000 feet, speed 230 miles per hour. Time to intercept, 15 minutes. Hiroshi had flown 42 combat missions against American bombers. He knew their reputation. Japanese pilots called the B-29 the invincible fortress. And for good reason. The specifications alone were enough to make any fighter pilot sweat. Maximum speed, 357 miles per hour. Service ceiling, 31,850 feet. Range, 3,250 miles. Bomb load, 20,000 pounds. This wasn't just a bigger bomber. It was something from a different era entirely. By March 1945, the strategic bombing campaign against Japan had reached a critical turning point. American forces controlled the Mariana Islands, Guam, Saipan, and Tinian. Tokyo was now within range. The B-29 represented a technological leap that Japan couldn't match. Every pilot in the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force knew it. They'd seen the intelligence reports. They'd heard the stories from other squadrons. The B-29 was faster than anything Japan could throw at it. It climbed higher, it carried more bombs, and it flew further. But there was one specification that made the B-29 truly different. One feature that changed everything about how air combat would be fought. It wasn't just the size or the range. It was the defensive armament system. Previous American bombers, the B-17 Flying Fortress and the B-24 Liberator, relied on manned gun turrets. Gunners sat exposed in cramped positions, manually aiming and firing 50-caliber machine guns at attacking fighters. The system was effective, but limited. Each gunner could only cover one sector of the sky. Coordination between positions was difficult, and at high altitude, gunners suffered from cold, hypoxia, and fatigue. Their accuracy dropped. Their reaction time slowed. They were human, and human limitations meant vulnerability. The B-29 changed everything, but Hiroshi didn't know that yet. As he climbed through 5,000 feet, checking his ammunition, 120 rounds per 20mm cannon, 350 rounds per machine gun, he had no idea what he was about to encounter. He had no idea that in the next few minutes he would discover why Japanese fighter squadrons were losing the air war over Japan. He had no idea that his first attack would teach him a lesson that came far too late to matter. All he knew was that tonight, for the first time in months, the Americans were flying low. Lower than any previous raid, lower than Japanese fighters could normally reach them. Tonight, he had a chance. Tonight, he thought, would be different. Lieutenant Nakamura Hiroshi joined the Imperial Japanese Army Air Force in 1942. He trained on the Nakajima Ki-43 Hayabusa, a nimble fighter that had dominated the skies over China and Southeast Asia in the war's early years. By 1945, he'd transitioned to the Ki-84 Hayate, one of Japan's most advanced fighters. On paper, it was formidable. Maximum speed, 392 miles per hour. Service ceiling, 34,450 feet. Armament. 2 20mm cannons and 2 12.7mm machine guns. On paper, it could intercept B-29 seconds at any altitude. It could match American P-51 Mustangs in speed and maneuverability. But paper specifications didn't account for reality. By March 1945, Japan's air defense system was collapsing. Fuel shortages limited training flights. Experienced pilots were dead or reassigned. Maintenance crews lacked spare parts. Many Ki-84 seconds couldn't reach their rated performance because they were flying on poor quality fuel and running worn-out engines that should have been rebuilt months ago. Hiroshi's squadron, the 47th Sentai, based at Narimasu Airfield, northwest of Tokyo, had started the war with 36 aircraft. By March 1945, only 14 remained operational. Of those 14, only 8 had experienced pilots. The rest were replacements with less than 50 hours of combat flying. In the early war, Japan had trained replacement pilots for 2 years before sending them into combat. Now, they got 3 months if they were lucky. Hiroshi was one of the lucky ones. 42 missions meant he'd survived longer than most. It meant he understood the rhythms of American bombing raids. It meant he knew how to position himself, how to read the formations, how to time an attack. But it also meant he'd learned Japanese fighter tactics the hard way, through trial and error, and watching friends die when the errors were fatal. Japanese fighter tactics against B-29 seconds had evolved through brutal trial and error. Early attempts at tail attacks proved suicidal. The B-29's tail guns could engage targets at 1,000 yards. Beam attacks from the side were ineffective. The remote turrets tracked too quickly, correcting for any attempt to slip in from the flank. Head-on attacks offered the best chance, but they required precise timing and nerves of steel. You had to dive toward the formation, fire a quick burst at the lead bomber, then pull up and away before the defensive guns could track you and tear your fighter apart. Hiroshi had attempted 3 head-on attacks in previous missions. Each time, he'd been driven off by defensive fire before reaching effective range. The B-29's guns seemed to track him before he even began his attack run. The tracers came from multiple directions simultaneously, and the volume of fire was overwhelming. It didn't make sense. A formation of B-17 seconds or B-24 seconds couldn't produce that kind of coordinated defense. The guns on those bombers were independent. One gunner in the tail, one in the waist, one in the top turret. They couldn't all fire at the same target at exactly the same time unless they were incredibly lucky. But the B-29 seconds were always coordinated. Always. Hiroshi had reported this to his commanding officer after his 3rd mission against the B-29 seconds. The response had been dismissive. "Enemy bombers have remote turrets," the commander had said. "It makes no difference. Press your attacks closer. Aim for the cockpit. The Americans are running out of bombers. Eventually, we'll wear them down." No one seemed to understand what remote turrets actually meant in combat. Hiroshi had tried to explain it. The guns weren't being aimed from inside the bomber. They were being controlled from inside the bomber, but aimed from outside. But how could that make them more accurate? How could that explain the coordinated fire? Tonight, he would find out. As his Ki-84 climbed through 5,500 feet, Hiroshi checked his oxygen supply. The mask fit tight against his face. He was breathing fast, nervous energy and adrenaline. 42 missions, and he still got nervous before an intercept. The good pilots did. The ones who didn't get nervous were usually the ones who didn't come home. He ran through the attack profile one more time. Position ahead of the formation. Climb to 8,000 feet. Dive through at maximum speed. Fire at 750 yards. Break away before minimum separation distance. Get out. Climb back to altitude. Look for stragglers. Try again, if there was time. It was a tactic he'd practiced dozens of times in his head, lying in his barracks at Narimasu airfield, knowing that each mission might be the one where the numbers caught up with him. 42 missions were a long time to survive. Some pilots didn't make it past 5. Some didn't make it past 1. Hiroshi was due. But not tonight. Or at least, that's what he told himself as ground control. Vectored him toward the lead elements of the American formation. His orders were clear. Attack from the front. Aim for the cockpit and engines. Break away before reaching minimum separation distance. Standard head-on tactics. Tactics that had been developed against B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds before the B-29 arrived to change everything. Tactics that, in just a few minutes, would prove to be absolutely, completely, and fatally obsolete. At 11:58 p.m., Hiroshi spotted the first B-29 seconds. They appeared as dark silhouettes against the lighter sky, flying in loose formation at 7,000 feet. He counted 30 bombers in the first wave, with more following behind. The formation stretched for miles. It was like watching a slow-moving city descend from the heavens. Ground control vectored him toward the lead elements. His orders were clear, but Hiroshi had learned something in 42 missions. Orders and reality rarely matched. The Americans didn't fly the way intelligence reports said they flew. The formations weren't as tight as expected. The defensive fire came from unexpected angles. And the B-29 seconds, despite their massive size, moved through the air with an almost graceful precision that made them harder to target than smaller bombers. Hiroshi positioned his Ki-84 3 miles ahead of the formation, climbing to 8,000 feet to give himself a slight altitude advantage. His plan was simple: dive through the formation. Fire a burst at the lead bomber, aiming for the cockpit and engines. Pull up and away before the defensive guns could track him. It was the same tactic he'd used on his previous 3 B-29 intercepts. It had driven off the bombers, but hadn't resulted in any kills. Tonight, he was determined, would be different. At 1 mile distance, Hiroshi rolled inverted and pulled into a steep dive, accelerating to 400 miles per hour. The lead B-29 grew larger in his gun sight. He could see the bomber's nose glazing, the 4 massive engines, the distinctive high tail. At 800 yards, he pressed the firing button. His 20mm cannons roared, sending shells toward the B-29's cockpit. Tracers arced through the night sky like deadly fireworks. For a moment, just a moment, Hiroshi felt the satisfaction of seeing his rounds connect with the target. He saw impacts, flashes of light as armor-piercing shells struck metal. Then something happened that Hiroshi had never experienced before. The B-29's defensive fire didn't come from the tail or waist positions. It came from everywhere at once. Tracers converged on his fighter from the top, bottom, and sides simultaneously. The volume of fire was 3 times heavier than anything he'd encountered on previous missions. It was as if the entire formation had turned to face him at once, and every gun was aimed directly at his cockpit. Hiroshi broke left, pulling 6 Gs in a desperate evasive maneuver. His fighter screamed under the stress, wings bending under the gravitational load. Tracers followed him through the turn like luminous snakes hunting their prey. He heard impacts, metallic clangs as .50 caliber rounds struck his aircraft's tail and left wing. His cockpit filled with the smell of cordite and hydraulic fluid. Alarm bells screamed in his headset as warning lights illuminated across his instrument panel. He'd been in range for less than 3 seconds. In those 3 seconds, the B-29 had fired more rounds at him than an entire formation of B-17 seconds could produce in 30 seconds. It didn't make sense. It was impossible. But the impacts in his fuselage and the screaming alarms in his cockpit confirmed that it was real. As Hiroshi pulled away, climbing back to attack altitude, his hands shaking on the control stick, he realized something was fundamentally different about the B-29's defensive system. The guns had tracked him before he opened fire. They'd engaged from multiple positions simultaneously, and they'd followed him through his evasion maneuver with impossible accuracy. This wasn't normal defensive fire. This was something else, something coordinated, something deliberate, something that seemed to anticipate his movements before he made them. Hiroshi circled at 10,000 feet, watching other Japanese fighters attempt their attacks. Each time, the result was the same. A brief burst of cannon fire followed by overwhelming defensive fire from multiple B-29 turrets, forcing the attacker to break away. The Americans weren't panicking. They weren't scattering. They were maintaining formation, and their guns were maintaining a perfect defensive perimeter around the bombers. One Ki-84 from his squadron, flown by Sergeant Tanaka, pressed his attack too close. Hiroshi watched as tracers from 3 different B-29 turrets converged on Tanaka's fighter. The red tracers intersected in midair like deadly lines of geometry, and for a moment, Tanaka's Ki-84 disappeared inside the cone of fire. When it emerged, it was broken. The left wing was shredded. Flames poured from the engine cowling. Tanaka managed to get the fighter pointed downward, but he didn't pull up. He couldn't pull up. His aircraft was falling, tumbling through the night sky, trailing smoke and fire like a comet plummeting toward the earth. Hiroshi watched until the impact, a brief flash of light far below over Tokyo Bay. That's when Hiroshi understood. The B-29's guns weren't being aimed by individual gunners. They were being controlled by a central system that coordinated all defensive positions. When one gunner acquired a target, other turrets automatically tracked the same fighter. The system calculated lead angles and firing solutions faster than any human gunner could, faster than any human could think. This explained everything. The impossible tracking speed, the coordinated fire from multiple positions, the accuracy at long range, the way the guns seemed to anticipate where a fighter would be, not where it was. The B-29 wasn't defended by individual gunners, it was defended by a computer. Japanese intelligence had reported that American bombers used remote turrets, but no one had explained what that meant in practice. Hiroshi now understood. The B-29's gunners sat inside the pressurized fuselage, safe from the elements, operating sighting stations that controlled unmanned turrets mounted on the aircraft's exterior. They weren't exposed to the cold and thin air at 30,000 feet. They weren't limited by physical position. And most crucially, they could control multiple turrets simultaneously from a single fire control center. It was revolutionary. It was devastating. And it made every tactic Japan had developed in the last 3 years completely, utterly obsolete. The system gave American gunners 3 critical advantages that Hiroshi was only now beginning to comprehend. First, visibility. The gunners used optical sights with magnification, allowing them to acquire targets at longer ranges than Japanese pilots could see through their gun sights. The B-29's gunners could engage fighters at 1,000 yards, well beyond the effective range of Japanese 20mm cannons. By the time Hiroshi could see the B-29 clearly enough to aim accurately, he was already in the effective range of their defensive fire. It was a mismatch built into the geometry of the engagement itself. Second, coordination. The fire control officer, typically the upper gunner, could direct all turrets to engage priority targets. If a fighter attacked from the front, both forward turrets would track it automatically. If it broke away, the rear turrets would take over without delay or hesitation. There were no gaps in coverage. There was no dead zone where a fighter could hide. The B-29's defensive sphere was complete, overlapping, and impossible to penetrate. Third, computational accuracy. And this was the truly terrifying part. The B-29 carried analog computers that calculated ballistic trajectories based on target range, airspeed, altitude, and angular velocity. They automatically adjusted for parallax, the difference between where the gunner sat and where the guns were mounted. They compensated for the bomber's own movement through the air. They calculated lead angles that accounted for the time bullets needed to reach the target. A human gunner might estimate these factors, making educated guesses based on experience. The B-29's computer calculated them with mathematical precision. The implications were staggering. A human gunner had to see the target, estimate its distance, estimate its speed, estimate how far ahead to aim, and then fire. All of that took time. All of that was subject to error. All of that could be defeated if a fighter pilot was skilled enough and brave enough. But a machine didn't estimate. A machine calculated. A machine didn't hesitate. A machine didn't get tired or cold or scared. A machine processed information and delivered fire solutions with inhuman speed and accuracy. Hiroshi had spent 3 years learning how to survive against American bombers. He'd learned to recognize the patterns of their defensive fire. He'd learned to exploit the gaps between gun turrets. He'd learned to time his attacks so that he could get in, fire, and get out before the gunners could track him. He'd learned tactics that worked against B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds, tactics that other experienced pilots had developed through trial and error and at the cost of hundreds of lives. All of that knowledge, accumulated through blood and death and sacrifice, was now completely useless. Japanese fighter tactics developed against B-17 seconds and B-24 seconds assumed that defensive fire would come from individual gunners with limited fields of fire and manual aiming systems. The head-on attack assumed the front gunners would be slow to track a diving fighter. The beam attack assumed the side gunners would have difficulty tracking a target moving perpendicular to their line of sight. The beam climbing tail attack assumed the rear gunners would be distracted by multiple simultaneous threats. Against the B-29 central fire control system, all of these tactics were suicide. Worse than suicide, actually. Suicide implied choice. These tactics were just death with a uniform and a military rank. Hiroshi realized, watching the formation continue its inexorable march toward Tokyo, that the air war was over. Japan had already lost. Not in some abstract strategic sense, but in the most concrete sense possible. The technology gap was unbridgeable. The B-29 represented a class of weapon that Japanese aviation simply could not counter. Not with current tactics, not with current technology, not with the training and resources available in March 1945. The Americans hadn't just built a better bomber. They'd built a bomber that made all existing fighter tactics obsolete. They'd weaponized mathematics. They'd turned fire control into a problem that could only be solved by computation, not by courage or skill or sacrifice. And Japan didn't have the time, resources, or industrial capacity to develop an answer. Hiroshi had no way to communicate this discovery to other pilots. He had no way to warn them that conventional attacks wouldn't work. He had no way to stop them from continuing to die against a system they didn't understand and couldn't defeat. Radio discipline was strict during combat operations. You didn't broadcast realizations or theories. You followed orders and completed your mission. But as Hiroshi watched the B-29 formation press deeper into Japanese airspace, as he watched other key 84 seconds attempt their attacks and get driven off or shot down, he understood that he was witnessing the technological death of Japanese aviation. The B-29 wasn't just winning the air war, it was making the air war itself a foregone conclusion. The Americans had figured out something fundamental about modern warfare. Integration matters more than individual components. The B-29's 50-caliber machine guns weren't more powerful than Japanese 20mm cannons. Japanese cannons fired larger, heavier projectiles, but when integrated into a computer-controlled network, when coordinated and aimed with mathematical precision, when backed by visibility and coordination advantages, those 50-caliber guns became devastatingly more effective than manually aimed weapons could ever be. Japanese aviation engineers understood this principle. They'd started experimenting with remote turrets and centralized fire control, but by 1945, Japan lacked the industrial capacity, resources, and time to develop equivalent systems. The factories were bombed. The materials were scarce, the skilled engineers were diverted to other projects, and most crucially, there were no more months left. The war was measured in weeks now, not years. Hiroshi had perhaps 10 minutes to figure out a new tactic before the B-29 formation reached Tokyo. 10 minutes to solve a problem that American engineers and Japanese engineers had been working on for years. He was going to need to think of something desperate. At 12:14 a.m., the first B-29 seconds began dropping their payloads. But these weren't high-explosive bombs designed to destroy military installations or industrial targets. These were M69 incendiary clusters, each containing 47 6-pound napalm bomblets designed to start fires in Tokyo's wooden buildings. The city below erupted in flames. Hiroshi could see the fires spreading from his altitude, block by block, district by district, entire neighborhoods transforming into infernos in real time. The Americans weren't targeting military installations. They were targeting the city itself. They were targeting civilians. But Hiroshi didn't have time to process the horror unfolding below him. He had seconds to act. The B-29 formation was still vulnerable during the bombing run. The bombers had to maintain their course and attitude while releasing their loads. They couldn't maneuver. They couldn't scatter. For perhaps 2 minutes, they were constrained by the physics of precision bombing. It was the only opening he would get. Hiroshi pushed his Ki-84 into a steep dive, approaching the B-29 formation from below and behind. It was a desperate tactic, born from desperation and the realization that conventional attacks were suicide. The lower rear turret on the B-29 had limited traverse. It couldn't rotate far enough downward to track a fighter attacking from directly below. It was a blind spot, not a large blind spot, not a safe blind spot, but it was the only advantage Japanese fighters had left. Hiroshi would climb rapidly from below, fire a burst into the bomber's belly, then dive away before the turrets could track him and tear his fighter to pieces. It was a tactic that would only work if he was fast enough, brave enough, and lucky enough. It was a tactic that turned a fighter pilot into a suicide bomber. But it was the only tactic left that might work. At 500 feet below the formation, Hiroshi pulled back on the stick, climbing at maximum power. His Ki-84 accelerated upward, closing the distance to the nearest B-29. The engines screamed under full throttle. Every ounce of power Hiroshi could extract was directed toward climbing speed. 200 miles per hour, 220, 250. He could see the bomber's bomb bay doors, still open after releasing its incendiary load. The opening was like a gaping mouth, swallowing the night sky. If he could get a burst into that opening, into the belly of the aircraft, where the fuel tanks and bomb racks were located, he might cripple the bomber. He might force it down. He might actually achieve something tonight, other than dying. At 300 yards, he opened fire. His 20mm cannons sent shells into the B-29's fuselage. He saw impacts, flashes of light as armor-piercing rounds struck metal. The shells were going exactly where he aimed them. For a moment, just a moment, he thought it might work. He thought that maybe, just maybe, he'd found a way to defeat this impossible bomber. Then the B-29's lower rear turret rotated toward him. Hiroshi saw the muzzle flashes before he heard the impacts. 50 caliber rounds tore through his left wing, shredding the aileron and puncturing the fuel tank. His cockpit filled with the smell of aviation gasoline, sharp and acrid and terrifying. He broke right, rolling inverted and diving away from the formation. His engines sputtered as fuel pressure dropped. His left wing was trailing smoke, a visible marker of his location that any other B-29 gunner could see. His hydraulic system was failing, making the control stick sluggish and unresponsive. Hiroshi had been in range for less than 2 seconds. In those 2 seconds, the B-29's defensive system had crippled his fighter. He fought the stick, using trim tabs and flaps to maintain control as the Ki-84 descended toward Narimasu airfield. The damaged wing wanted to drop. The fuselage wanted to spin. Every instinct screamed at him to bail out and let the aircraft fall into Tokyo Bay. But Narimasu was close, just 5 miles away. If he could keep the fighter in the air for 5 more minutes, he could land. He could survive. He could walk away from this night. The B-29 he'd attacked was still flying. It was smoking, yes, but it was still flying, still climbing, still heading toward its next bombing target. Hiroshi's 20mm shells had hit it, but they hadn't stopped it. The computer-controlled defensive system had seen him coming and had responded with lethal efficiency. The human pilot had managed to damage the bomber, but the machine had managed to cripple the fighter. The outcome was never in doubt. As Hiroshi descended, struggling to keep his damaged Ki-84 airborne, struggling with the stick and the sluggish controls, he understood the terrible truth. Japanese fighters couldn't defeat the B-29. Not with current tactics, not with current technology, not with the training and resources available in March 1945. The B-29 wasn't just a better bomber, it was a technological leap that Japanese aviation couldn't match. It was a weapon from the future, and Japan was still fighting with the weapons of the past. At 1:47 Hiroshi managed to land his crippled Ki-84 at Narimasu airfield. His left wing was shredded, his fuel tank nearly empty, his hydraulic system completely failed. Ground crews counted 37 bullet holes in the aircraft's fuselage and wings. He climbed out of the cockpit on shaking legs, his flight suit soaked with sweat and aviation fuel. He was alive. Against all odds, against the fire and the steel and the mathematics of the B-29's fire control system, he was alive. He was one of the lucky ones. Of the 8 Ki-84 seconds from his squadron that engaged the B-29 formation that night, only 3 returned. To base, Sergeant Tanaka's fighter had exploded in midair, torn apart by concentrated .50 caliber fire. Lieutenant Yamamoto crashed on approach, his aircraft too damaged to control, his body burned beyond recognition in the wreckage. Sergeant Ito bailed out over Tokyo Bay and was never recovered. 2 other pilots were listed as missing, last seen pursuing B-29 seconds toward the coast. The 47th Sentai had lost 5 fighters and 5 pilots in less than 90 minutes. They had shot down 0 B-29 seconds. The raid itself was catastrophically effective. 334 B-29 seconds dropped 1,665 tons of incendiary bombs on Tokyo. The resulting firestorm killed an estimated 100,000 civilians and destroyed 16 square miles of the city. An area larger than the combined destruction of the atomic bombs dropped on Hiroshima and Nagasaki 4 months later. The fire was so intense that it created its own weather system. Updrafts pulled burning debris miles into the air. People trying to flee the flames suffocated in the superheated air. Rivers boiled. The ground itself caught fire. Tokyo stopped being a city and became a furnace. Japanese air defenses shot down 14 B-29 seconds that night, a loss rate of 4%. For an American bomber force, 4% losses on a single raid was considered acceptable. It was regrettable, but sustainable. The Americans could replace 14 bombers. They could replace the crews. They could absorb the losses and continue bombing. But Japanese fighter squadrons lost 126 aircraft, a 9-to-1 kill ratio in favor of the Americans. The numbers told the story with brutal clarity. The B-29's central fire control system had fundamentally changed the balance of air combat. Japanese fighters designed to engage manned bombers with limited defensive fire couldn't survive against computer-directed turrets that tracked multiple targets simultaneously. The mathematics were merciless. The technology was absolute, and there was no way to argue with the results. In the weeks following the March 9th raid, Japanese air commanders attempted to develop new tactics. They tried night attacks, hoping darkness would reduce the effectiveness of the B-29's optical sights. The B-29 seconds had infrared detection systems. Night attacks didn't work. They tried masked formations, hoping to overwhelm the defensive system with multiple simultaneous attacks from different angles. The fire control computers could prioritize targets. Masked formations didn't work. They even tried ramming attacks, kamikaze tactics adapted for air-to-air combat. Pilots would dive their fighters directly at the B-29 seconds, intending to collide with the bombers and damage them through sheer desperation and sacrifice. The ramming attacks occasionally damaged B-29 seconds, but they rarely shot them down, and every ramming attack meant a pilot who would never come home. Every ramming attack meant a sacrifice that achieved nothing except delaying the inevitable. Nothing worked. The B-29's fire control system was simply too advanced. It was too coordinated. It was too accurate. It was defended by mathematics, and you cannot win an argument with mathematics. By August 1945, American B-29 seconds had dropped 160,000 tons of incendiary and high-explosive bombs on Japanese cities. They flew with near impunity despite desperate Japanese fighter resistance. The strategic bombing campaign destroyed 67 cities and killed an estimated 300,000 civilians. Some historians argue the true number was higher. The Japanese kept incomplete records. Many deaths went uncounted. 300,000 people dead. Entire cities erased from the map. All because one nation had managed to weaponize mathematics while another nation was still trying to fight with courage and skill and sacrifice. Lieutenant Hiroshi survived the war. He made it through another 4 months of continued B-29 raids, continued desperate attacks, continued losses that achieved nothing. He watched his squadron get smaller and smaller until there were barely enough pilots left to fly combat missions. He watched Japan's air defense system collapse completely. By August, Japanese fighters rarely engaged the B-29 seconds anymore. There was no point. The bombers came, they dropped their loads, and the fighters either got shot down or didn't. The outcome didn't change anything. Hiroshi's squadron didn't survive. The 47th Sentai was disbanded in July 1945. The surviving pilots were transferred to other units or reassigned to ground defense duties. By the end of the war, most of them were dead. Some shot down by B-29 gunners, some killed in accidents with damaged aircraft, some took their own lives rather than face surrender. Hiroshi was one of the few who made it to August and lived past the end of the war. He survived, but his war ended not with victory, but with the crushing realization that his nation had lost a technological race. It didn't even know it was running. The B-29's Central Fire Control System represented one of World War II's most significant technological innovations. Developed by General Electric between 1940 and 1943, the system combined analog computers, remotely controlled turrets, and coordinated fire control into an integrated defensive network. The technology wasn't perfect. The analog computers sometimes malfunctioned at high altitude. The remote turrets occasionally jammed. The system required extensive maintenance between missions. B-29 crews spent hours calibrating sights and testing fire control circuits. Ground crews worked through the night to keep the system operational. But even with these limitations, the system gave American bombers a decisive advantage over Japanese fighters. More than that, it represented a fundamental shift in how war would be fought in the future. Individual skill and courage and determination still mattered, but they mattered less and less. Technological integration mattered more. Computational accuracy mattered more. The ability to coordinate multiple weapons systems into a unified defensive network mattered more than anything a single pilot could achieve. The Central Fire Control System influenced post-war aviation development in profound ways. Modern military aircraft, from bombers to fighters to attack helicopters, all use computer-assisted targeting systems descended from the B-29's analog fire control computers. The concept of remote weapon stations, now standard on unmanned aerial vehicles, originated with the B-29's remote turrets. Every drone that fires a missile from 500 miles away is the direct descendant of the technology Hiroshi encountered on that desperate night over Tokyo. The system demonstrated a fundamental principle of military technology that would dominate warfare for the rest of the 20th century and into the 21st. Integration matters more than individual components. The B-29's 50 caliber machine guns weren't more powerful than Japanese 20mm cannons. But when integrated into a computer-controlled network, when coordinated and aimed with mathematical precision, when backed by visibility and coordination advantages that human gunners could never match, those 50 caliber guns became far more effective than manually aimed weapons. Japanese aviation engineers understood this principle. But by 1945, Japan lacked the industrial capacity, resources, and time to develop equivalent systems. The factories were bombed, the materials were scarce, The skilled engineers were diverted to other projects. Japan was fighting a war it had already lost. It just didn't know it yet. Lieutenant Hiroshi survived the war, but his squadron didn't. The 47th Sentai was scattered across the wreckage of a defeated nation. Some pilots died in the final months of fighting. Some died in accidents. Some took their own lives rather than face surrender. Hiroshi was one of the few who lived to see August 1945, to see Japan sign the instrument of surrender, to see the American occupation begin. He lived to understand what his discovery on that desperate night had meant, and he lived long enough to see the world that his nation's defeat had created. The technological gap between American and Japanese aviation had become unbridgeable by March 1945, but the gap didn't close with the end of the war. It expanded. American engineers took the lessons of the B-29's fire control system and built on them. They refined the technology. They made it more reliable, more accurate, more deadly. They miniaturized it. They put it on fighters. They put it on helicopters. They eventually put it on unmanned aircraft that could fire weapons from miles away without any pilot in the cockpit at all. Japan, meanwhile, started from zero. The nation was occupied. Its military was dismantled. Its industrial base was destroyed. Japanese engineers had to rebuild from scratch, learning from American technology that had been captured or shared through post-war cooperation. It took decades for Japan to rebuild its aviation industry. When it did, it was always playing catch-up, always learning from American innovations, always trying to match what the Americans had already accomplished. The B-29's central fire control system represented more than just a technological advantage in one war. It represented the future of warfare itself. It represented the principle that would dominate military technology for generations to come, that integration, coordination, and computation matter more than individual components or individual courage, that a system of weapons can be more powerful than the sum of its parts, that mathematics can defeat skill, that computation can defeat courage. Hiroshi's discovery on March 9, 1945, that the Konantu B-29's defensive system was computer-controlled and impossible to defeat with conventional tactics, came too late to change the outcome of the air war over Japan. But his experience illustrated a larger truth about World War II. The conflict was decided not just by courage and tactics, it was decided by technology and industrial capacity. The nation that could build the future first would win. The nation that couldn't keep up would lose. The B-29 Superfortress, with its revolutionary central fire control system, represented American technological superiority in its most devastating form. And Japanese pilots like Lieutenant Hiroshi paid the price for that technological gap with their lives. Hundreds of them, thousands if you count all the nations that the Americans fought against. The war taught a lesson that would echo through the rest of the 20th century and beyond. Technology wins, integration wins, computation wins. The future belongs to the nation that can build it first. Hiroshi lived to see the beginning of that future. He survived the war and lived into the 1970s, watching American jets and helicopters dominate conflicts around the world, watching drones emerge as a new class of weapons descended directly from the B-29's remote turrets. He watched the technological principles he'd learned in combat through blood and fire, and the deaths of his friends become the foundation of modern warfare. The terrible irony is that Hiroshi was right. He understood what the B-29's fire control system meant. He understood that it represented a technological leap that couldn't be matched. He understood that the air war was already lost before it really began, but he was right too late. His knowledge came after the decision had already been made. His understanding arrived after the outcome had already been determined. Japan lost the air war, not because its pilots were less brave or less skilled. Japan lost the air war because it couldn't match American industrial capacity and American technological innovation. By March 1945, The outcome was inevitable. Not in some abstract sense, but in the most concrete, mathematical, computational sense possible. The B-29, with its computer-controlled fire system, was a weapon from the future. Japan was still fighting with the weapons of the past. The lesson would be learned again and again in the decades that followed. In Korea, in Vietnam, in the Middle East, the nation with superior technology doesn't always win, but the nation with superior technology integrated into a coordinated system, that nation wins almost every time. Because you can't defeat mathematics, you can't outmaneuver a computer, you can't overcome a system designed by engineers who understood that the future belonged to those who could integrate multiple components into a unified whole. Lieutenant Hiroshi understood this. He learned it in 3 seconds over Tokyo Bay, on a night when 300,000 people were dying in a firestorm below him. He learned it when the guns came from everywhere at once, and his fighter was crippled before he could even break away. He learned it too late to change anything, but he lived long enough to understand what it all meant, and that understanding, passed down through the veterans who survived, became the foundation of post-war military doctrine. Integration matters. Coordination matters. Computation matters. The future belongs to those who can build it. This is Tales of Valor. We explore World War II beyond the battlefield, revealing how technology, intelligence, and innovation shaped the war's outcome. Thank you for watching.